I'm sorry, I have forgotten how to do this since we did that a few minutes ago. Okay.
So Emily, if you would go to her name, go to participants and go to her name.
Oh, I see now. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No worries.
Okay, here we go, guys.
Cool. Right.
Oh, also, if I can say one more thing, I'm so sorry. Anybody who has questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll tell Maxine when they come up. But if I've missed over it, just like tell me or something. So feel free to ask questions.
Thank you. So like Emily said, I'm Maxine Spencer, the Moresby Program Specialist at the Oasis Center. And here, what we're going to talk today is about oppressive systems and how they can manifest in the lives of Black trans young people. And so before we get into all the details, I want to do a little bit of intention setting. And so first of all, I want to affirm that Black trans people are not a monolith. So there's a variety of experiences that people have and people are a part of. And so even with the data that I will be bringing in, that might not necessarily always be someone's experience. Someone's experience could be radically different than data. And what the data show isn't necessarily all that great. So one person might have this one pleasant experience in this one other way, and this one other person might have another experience in another. But really, I'll say all that to say is that we aren't a monolith. And even though we can try to speak generally and really try to ground ourselves in what data is saying, our experiences are varied. And going into data, I kind of want to also really affirm that there needs to be a wider body of research when it comes to Black trans people, but especially young people. So a lot of the statistics that I will be bringing do include Black trans young people, but in some of the spaces, there has not been enough of that kind of specific research focused solely on Black trans young people. For example, there's also information I'll be bringing in from the United States Transgender Survey, which was done back in 2015, which has great information. But when you get down to young people, there is not as much specific information out there. So when we're talking about the cutting edge of what it means to do research and to really think about what people's experiences are and to really do all of that scientific analysis, Black trans young people are part of that. And that there needs to be so much more work to be done on us, not just addressing their needs, but in this kind of data collection and really being able to say, you know, on a numbers level, what's going on. And so I'll also be speaking from my own experience a little bit. And so as like a younger person, like my own self and kind of growing up, I may occasionally like interject different pieces of information with just parts of my own story, parts of my own understanding of things. And then also I want to say, let this be a brave space for learning. So kind of wanted to be what I mean by brave space is, I mean that this is a space to feel okay to challenge things, to feel like if you have questions that you can voice them, and this is a space that we can come together and learn and really try to understand the impact of the choices that people make, and really also be very mindful of what the intent of those choices. So kind of just being very brave and saying like, okay, I feel kind of confused. So I want to voice this out. I need more clarification. And so if you feel like you also need to stop me, please either message in the chat, and if I'm going too fast or if something's kind of not clicking, then we can talk about it. And kind of going to the next point, if you feel like something here challenges you, please feel free to speak up about that. Really, I want this to be a space and to be a time where we all can feel free to like voice out what we don't know, because that's one of the most difficult parts, is to kind of like admit, you know, I really don't know. Like, and that's one of the most difficult answers that really I feel like you can always give. It's like, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how that makes sense. So please, 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 like, air it out. And again, I will do my best to focus on young people that are minors, so how we might typically call young people or youth, but I also will be bringing in a context of young people that are 18 or 24-year-olds. And so when it comes to like more specific data, like the United States Transgender Survey, for example, so a lot of those respondents were 18 to 24, but they're still youth. And so I'll be bringing in kind of both aspects as well. And I do want to mention that there will be a brief mention of sexual assault and suicide. And there is not necessarily details or anything like that, but there will be a brief mention of those two terms. And also just, I will be talking about violence specifically against Black trans people. And so if that, I will be talking about that a little bit more in depth, not necessarily graphic or anything, but I just want to like say that those things will be mentioned. So we're going to go ahead and move on into breaking down different types of identity. And so I want to start kind of parsing out what it means to have all these different identities, because when we start talking about trans people, really, I feel like I want to make sure we're all like on a good baseline of what we mean by that, of what we mean, or like what really even these different terminologies people might throw around might mean. So I want to start talking about gender identity, which is basically sort of like how you would identify your own self. And that can come out as sort of being a cis woman, being a cis man. That is more so kind of the unmutable and kind of self-described understanding of who your gender is and what it is. And so if you look at the gender elephant here on the screen, you have a spectrum of when it comes to like, of being this kind of like woman, this male, and to be fair, it's not all the way there, but you know, we have other genders, like there's a spectrum of being, of understanding who your identity, of what your identity is. And so really, I like to think of gender identity, especially as a sphere. And I normally have a better, where is my little, okay, I don't have it with me right now, but imagine that you have in your hand like a ball. So imagine like a little ball right here. And so how I like to always encourage people to think about gender identity is that we kind of have these different spectrums like around like this equator right here of like going from male to female, and that there's kind of like this full spectrum and then kind of like there's nothing else around it. But really for lots of different folks, it's not necessarily this one spectrum. It's more so kind of like, you have a different location in like this part of the hemisphere or in this part of the hemisphere, and that it can also change as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be this one static part of a spectrum. It can go around, it can go above. I love how it's described as kind of wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, if you are a fan of Doctor Who. So kind of in that same sort of vein, in that it can be any part of that. And so it's really about who that person is and what they say they are. So next, you're kind of going into gender expression. With gender expression, that's basically like how you're presenting your gender, and that could be masculine, feminine, and could be kind of an androgynous state, however you want to define that. And but it's more so focused on, this is how I express myself, and this is not necessarily, this is how I want to look in this moment. And so, and then next we're going to go into sex assigned at birth. And one thing that I really like about the gender elephant is that there's kind of still more of like a spectrum of difference, because there, even though there is this kind of typically understood notion of this kind of like you're a female, you're a male, but really when you get down to it and you get down into more of the different like terms and different like realities, it's not always so cut and dry. It just feels cut and dry because we like to make it cut and dry. So there's different ways of just being, even when it comes to like your sex assigned at birth, and that can still vary. And for some people, you might never know, but it still varies for you. And next I want to talk about sexual and romantic orientation. And so really that's just kind of like who you're really attracted to, and like who do you think of when it comes to like your own attractions. So basically that could be men, women, like how many other genders, like however specific you want to make that. There's so many different terms when it comes to really all of these, but really I want to focus on that out of all of this, this is still part of not necessarily this cut and dry box, that there's still a full variety of like difference that exist. And then next, I want to kind of go around more specifically about being trans. And so there's this kind of current narrative around being trans that it's really, you know, I really felt like I was born one way and then I realized that there was another way that I could be, and that I decided to like switch. And I want to kind of like really bring up for here that that narrative doesn't necessarily reflect the totality of what it might mean to be trans. And so for lots of people, that still is very valid, and that's the way that they exist. But it's not the way that everybody exists, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. Some people focus on more so like their dysphoria, this kind of like discomfort and like the physical and emotional and psychological pain of just being identified in a certain way. But in some people, it's also the euphoria of it all. You understand yourself to really, really enjoy existing under this kind of term, under this kind of way. And so that's kind of part of like how you exist. So parsing out that gender dysphoria or that discomfort between mind and body, and that euphoria where there's not necessarily a discomfort, but there's still this understanding that I have always been this kind of way. That kind of really helps round out a little bit more this kind of understanding of what it might mean to be a trans person. And again, this is kind of going back into the intention that we said earlier, Black trans people aren't a monolith, but this is really kind of really affirming that there's so many different ways that you can be. And it's not necessarily that we have to gatekeep through dysphoria or through euphoria, but it's that I am who I am, and society sees me as someone different. And so I still take pride in that. So kind of in that same sort of vein. Because ultimately, with all of these differences, I kind of want to really bring out that being trans is kind of more so a socio-political identity that is also an umbrella term, because it's like, as I was talking about earlier, there's so many different labels, different identities that you could ascribe being around trans, and there's so many different cultural contexts that we in our society, like here now in Nashville, we would put on an understanding of this is a trans person, this is a trans identity, but really it's still very much different, and that this transgender term is an umbrella term that allows us to come together under a specific identity to advocate for ourselves as a community. So you have, for example, third genders in the hijras, and I believe Pakistan, Baklais in the Philippines, and there's specifically different identities that even the Zulu had. So, but it goes into different cultural contexts and different understandings that of what we would now call being trans. And so if they came over to where we are, we would understand them as being trans. And so that would be part of us putting that kind of cultural identifier on them. And also kind of the identifier being used in a way to kind of really reinforce like a stronger community and advocating for ourselves. And at one point, I kind of want to bring around all of this and really still talking about the diversity of trans people and how we call trans people. I really enjoy this understanding that even though we are a very small part of the overall adult population in the US, which is around like 1%, you really can't understand everything about like yourself or a concept if you don't fully grasp that last 1%. And so I really there was one image I saw on Instagram from another trans writer, and she basically said, think about the periodic table of elements and how often they occur. You feel like you see the periodic table, and it's like they must be always there. Like you can find every one of them so easily, so quickly. But in reality, they exist in like the 0.05 percentages. And so it's very rare to find most of these elements. And so it's not necessarily as frequent, but you still have to understand that. And you still have to accept and really grapple with the fact that they all exist. And so in this kind of way, you have to, even though you might feel like, well, this is just like a small percentage of people, there's still a vast amount of diversity and variety amongst us as a people, as trans people. And so it really takes, in order to fully understand how I would put it, even your own self, you have to really grapple with the understanding that trans people are so varied, and people's understanding of gender and themselves and society is widely varied as well. And so if we're really trying to like have that kind of understanding and have an understanding of ourselves, that is something that you have to take into consideration. So now I'm going to move into like different forms of oppression. And so for this, I'm going to ask if you feel comfortable, you can like unmute and we can talk about it, or you could also put it in a chat as well. But we're just trying to like name some different forms of oppression. So I have here homophobia, transphobia, ageism, white supremacy. So what are some other terms and other isms that we can fit in here?
I would say stigmatism as to like when it comes to HIV.
Mm. Stigma. Yeah.
In the chat box, Maxine, Lizzie, and Samantha noted classism.
Classism. Yeah. Are there any other forms of like oppression that people are thinking about? Or is there something that, you know, people have been thinking about just like in their own spare time as well? Because you could also talk about ableism, sort of how society is structured for folks that are disabled. That's one thing. Yeah, systemic oppression, just like health and criminal justice in particular. Is there any more? And we'll take one or two more if people have it. If not, we'll go ahead and move on to talking about what kind of connects all of this together. And so, what kind of connects all these different forms of oppression is ultimately power. And so really there, in all the cases that we've talked about, there's been a historically noted systematic societal like dominance over another group. And this power is usually displayed with policies, social norms, different attitudes, thinking about different procedures that you might have in different institutions, thinking about, you know, Jim Crow laws, you know, thinking about poll taxes, literacy tests. That's ways that power is coming out in these different systems of oppression. Also thinking about, you know, asking invasive questions of people when it's unnecessary. So lots of times, like people in the community, like people in the LGBTQ plus community, often might get a question from a doctor that's really ultimately too invasive when they're not necessarily asking or trying to address an issue about that specific like piece of health. It's just like, or thinking about just the anti-homelessness benches. So there's people that are in this kind of lower class of people that, you know, are still trying to really make it out, but then you can't even give them this kind of grace of just being on a bench and just kind of having this sort of peace. So thinking about in those kinds of ways of like the power being used like that. And so I want to talk for a little bit more. We're not going to do breakout rooms, but just talking a little bit more in the chat, or if you want to unmute or raise your hand, just about what are some different instances in which you've kind of seen power being used in any of these oppressive ways. So, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in like your own personal life. It could be something that you've read about in the news. It could be something that you've been thinking a lot about, something along those lines. And so we can just talk about that for like a minute or two. And if no one has anything like more distinctive, like they want to talk about, want to bring out with that, then I could bring in just even thinking about the couple of bills that have been going on against trans athletes, thinking about those specifically. Is there something in the chat? Yeah, in laws that allow service providers to discriminate against different groups of folks because it goes against their conscience. Yeah.
Hi. There was a very moving clip that I saw. I think it was the father of a transgender woman, but it's his daughter, who he was grown up very, very religious, and his daughter or his parents were pastors, and he came out and spoke about how finally they just let it go and they knew for their daughter to be happy, they had to embrace who she was. And he spoke up in front of, I think, their state legislature on behalf of the legislation you were talking about with sports and things like that.
Yeah, and so that's kind of like a part where, yeah, weaponizing religion as a means to justify discrimination. So that kind of goes back into a little bit more like these different isms and forms of oppression that we were bringing up, that kind of transphobia, that's an instant way of where that is being, of that power is being used against a group of people. And then you can talk about homophobia being used in that same way, saying like that legislative power is homophobic, and that it uses that power against this group of people. And so those are a couple different ways that oppression can kind of start to manifest in people's different lives. So I want to go ahead and try to play a little clip around Kimberly Crenshaw and the term intersectionality. And so this is basically where Kimberly Crenshaw starts talking about the term intersectionality and what it really means and what it really looks like. I know intersectionality is a term that's been talked about for a lot more now in the mainstream, but this is kind of where she starts kind of parsing it out a little bit more, and so I wanted to do that for us. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm having a couple more technical difficulties. Ugh. Okay, apologies, I'm having to stop the screen share for a moment. We might have to just skip the videos. I'm just not getting them to work. Something else keeps happening to the server, so I'm just gonna have to skip those. I don't want to take up too much time. I've already lost a little bit of time.
Maxine, when we're finished, if you want to get the links and post them into the chat so people can view them if they'd like, that would be okay.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Thank you. Oh my God. Sorry. PowerPoint is just messing up for me today. Cool. Okay. So I'll just paraphrase a little bit of what she would have been talking about there. So she was specifically talking about a case of a woman in a factory, and basically in the factory they were talking about there's of her case of trying to claim both racial and gender discrimination. In one case, when it came to jobs and came to moving up, the white women tended to be able to move into the clerk positions, that they dominated that sphere and they were able to get those jobs. When it came to more of the lower class jobs still, there were more Black men that were able to get those jobs. And so for her case as a Black woman, it was trying to really state before the court that she was at this different intersection, and that really when it came to thinking about the oppression she was facing in that context, that there was a specific intersection of racism and sexism that she was being affected by. And so as we think about all these different forms of oppressions, that we also have to consider that there are folks that are within these different intersections. And we have to think about intersectionality as this term where it is not just a static place of being, but it's continuous understanding of how oppression manifests for different folks' lives. As there are people, again, who have a variety of experiences, but might also be within one particular group. So within her case, being a Black woman, she faced this different set of oppressions that if you had just thought about oppression in one particular way, you would not have thought more about. And so I want to kind of get into like more so a lot of the data heavy information. And a lot of this information from here, I have a sources slide in the back, but a lot of this information is from the Trevor Project and from the United States Transgender Survey. So when we talk about, for example, trans and gender nonconforming Black students, they tend to experience greater levels of victimization based on just orientation, expression, and race and ethnicity than LGBTQ cis Black students. And so I kind of think that this is kind of like right out of the gate, one of those pieces of the intersection where if you had kind of looked at it in this kind of holistic lens and not necessarily thought deeper about it, you would not have necessarily asked the question, well, how much of, like, what are their experiences of just being victimized, and that's just of being victimized at school and being victimized, being kind of harassed, assaulted. What are these young people's experiences looking like? And I think there's more reasons for that when it comes to just transphobia in schools, particularly, that is kind of another axis of oppression that cis Black students aren't facing. But it's clear in this data that they are experiencing greater levels of it compared to cis Black students in high school. And going into more of the USTS information, about 74% of those Black respondents who were even out or perceived as transgender at some point between kindergarten and grade 12 experienced mistreatment. And so that looks like being verbally harassed, prohibited from dressing according to your identity, being disciplined more harshly, being physically or sexually assaulted because people even thought you were trans. And so just even the mere thought of it, of like being trans, is for some people an invitation to commit violence against you, even at school. like, or even during like your time as like a school child. And so think about that all the way from K through 12. Like this is supposed to be this is a formative time of your life. This is a very critical time of your life. But for these young people, just even being who they are, or even just being thought of being who they are, just leads to more violence, both in school and out of school. Just even thinking about more than half of those who were out or perceived as trans, they were verbally harassed, 28% were physically attacked, 19% were even sexually assaulted, again, because of being who they are. And again, still, I really want to drive home that even just being thought of being trans, that point, because there's such transphobia just within the cultural norms of our society, which includes not just other young people, but that would include potentially other adults that they would be around, just because there's so much transphobia that we have within our society, that this is what leads to these young people being attacked and being discriminated against, just even in school, like when they're at when they're at where it's considered their most vulnerable stage of life. And really, I want everybody to think about just what your experiences at school were like. You know, thinking about all the things that you might have gone through at school. That's not invalidating any of what you as an individual might have gone through, but thinking about that there's so many of young people who all that they might want is just an education. And you know, they might have dreams. I want to be a doctor, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be an architect. But thinking about how much that they're going to have to go through, not necessarily because of a choice that they're making, but because of the choices other people are making against them. And thinking about that, and then thinking about that 22% of these young people face such severe mistreatment that they left school, and 10% were expelled. 22%, that's a little bit over like 1 out of 5 of those young people had to leave school because of such severe mistreatment. This data right here is from the GLSEN 2019 report, specifically on Black, trans, on Black LGBTQ students. So a lot of this right here does talk about LGBTQ students in aggregate, and there is a little bit perhaps taking that out a little bit more, but still when we talk about Black LGBTQ students, they're included in that, but still not very specific. This is kind of one of those moments where I was talking about there's still aggregate data, but there's not necessarily as much of the specific data that needs to really come out. And that's more of the work that needs to be done. So like a majority of these students who experienced harassment or assault, just even in the past year, so back when they were doing the survey, like 2018, they never reported victimization to staff, mainly because they didn't think anyone would do anything about it. And now us as adults, we've thought about our place in school, thinking about all of that and thinking about what we've gone through, and thinking about that you could never tell, even like an adult, that you were supposed to have trusted, and someone that could have looked out for you, could have assisted you like they're supposed to, that you never, if you never would have been able to even think that they would do something about it. Now that's a serious problem. And that was almost 63% of those young people reported that their main, or at least reported that is the main reason why they didn't do it, is because no one would do anything. And when we have like a statistic like that, that says something really critically wrong is happening within schools. If these young people don't even feel like they can come to an adult to really address what's going on in school, then that's a major failure right there. And only a third reported that staff responded effectively when students did report. So thinking about, we have a third of young people that felt that staff responded effectively, but thinking about the 2/3 that did not feel that staff responded effectively. So that major discrepancy is really affecting these young people's lives and their access to education. Again, this is at school. This is like when young people, this is when you're at part of your most vulnerable, just developing, and you're supposed to be at this safe place. But even just in terms of what happens in school, you're already at risk of violence, at risk of transphobia. And then also, you're not necessarily supported by the adults that are supposed to be your backup, the adults that are supposed to be the ones to protect and like watch out for you and make sure that the space is safe for you. Half of these Black LGBTQ students that were surveyed felt unsafe at school because of their orientation, and 40.2% because of their expression, and then another like 30% because of their race or ethnicity. Again, going into kind of like that, thinking about everything in this kind of like intersectional, like understanding intersectionality is kind of this continuous process of thought, thinking about for all these different students, you know, that even with trans students being kind of understood to be a bit less of the population, that it's still very significant to have this many young people, just even because of like their gender expression, which would include everybody else in the community, that those young people would feel unsafe at school as well. And then also because people are feeling so unsafe just because of their orientation. Again, just because of who they are and where people are finding and feeling that kind of sense of discomfort and hurt and kind of that sense of vulnerability, that this is where these young people aren't necessarily feeling protected and like they can fully engage in school. Around a third of these students reported missing at least one day of school just in the last month of when the survey took because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. And about 10% missed 4 more days in the past month. Again, we want young people to go to school and to feel like they can really, really have a decent education. But just because of the way things have been structured and the lack of attention given to not just LGBTQ students, but just Black trans students in general, that they're being pushed out in their own specific way. And this is something that continues on into college. So about more like over a quarter, so about 28% who were out, and again, even perceived as being trans in college, were verbally, physically, or sexually harassed because of who they are. And so when it comes to education, there is almost a complete failure across the board. And this is something that continues on, even thinking about families. Again, school is one of those places where you're supposed to feel safe. And you're also supposed to feel like your family has your back as well. But less than half of those students had even told a family member about what they faced at school. And just thinking about that, less than half can even feel comfortable just asking either an adult at their school or even an adult in their own home or within their own family about what they face. And they're just kind of at risk and they're just kind of left to fend for themselves. And that's something that's, again, kind of like one of those cultural forms of where that transphobia comes in, and just kind of thinking about, well, the transphobia within our society is so intense that young trans people, especially, wouldn't have anywhere to go. So Black LGBTQ young people in total, but especially Black trans people, where do you go? Who do you talk to? Like, who do you talk to about all these things? There is, for so many young people, you don't have any of those options. Even when it comes, and still thinking about Black LGBTQ youth in aggregate with this data, and again, and really 1 in 3 of the young people in this data talking about Black LGBTQ young people identify as trans or non-binary. And so there's still that kind of representation within there. But just even thinking about still on the whole, there's so many of them. Over half of these young people reported that someone tried to convince them to change their orientation or their identity, that it's a choice that you can make. And really, for most of these young people, it was parents or caregivers and friends that were the most common folks that tried to convince someone else that they weren't who they were. So thinking about all the things you're going through at school, thinking about you're being verbally harassed at school, you don't feel like you can talk to your teachers, you're feeling unsafe, and then you might also have friends that are telling you, hey, you shouldn't just change it, you shouldn't just be that, why are you that way? And then you also can't even talk to your parents about it. And your parents might even also be ones to say like, yeah, you should change that. Like, just change it, like it's a choice. Like, thinking about that and thinking about all the young people that must be suffering in silence. I mean, even just thinking about that this still, again, like how we talked about earlier in one of the intentions, that there's so much more data that needs to be brought out, but really that kind of silence that we have from this lack of data is very loud, because even from what we're getting in this aggregate, it would just be the assumptions that we can make and what we can kind of start logically connecting is that it's just so much silence because people are suffering in that way. And so the silence that we already have currently is just deafening to others. I'm going to move on. Overall, about 35% of Black LGBTQ young people have experienced homelessness, been kicked out, or run away. And that is exceedingly higher for Black, trans, and non-binary young people. So it's like 45% compared to 31%. And furthermore, about 28% of Black LGBTQ young people who had experienced homelessness, been kicked out or run away, reported a suicide attempt in the past year, so in 2018, compared to the 11% who did not. And really, about twice as many Black, trans, and non-binary young people are reporting being kicked out or running away just due to their identity, as opposed to Black cis young people. So Black trans young people are at risk of being pushed out of their own homes, of being pushed out of their own safe spaces that they should feel like you have. Like, everyone has a family, however you identify it or whatever your family might look like, you all have a family. And so to have your family push you out, deny you, kick you out in that way, it's something that I don't understand, like how we don't talk enough about, and we don't really think about, and we don't address enough of, because there's so many young people that are just trying to live their lives and just trying to be who they are, but they don't have that opportunity because of the lack of supports at school, but then also in their home. And furthermore, going into family, when we get back into the USTS, trans women reported being more than twice as likely to have run away than trans men and non-binary people. And this is kind of one of those points where I think of thinking again about intersectionality as those kind of multiples of oppression, like being put out onto people's different lives, that in this instance, this is also a place where there's trans misogyny, there's a hatred of trans women. And particularly when you start thinking about how we view women in society, that is kind of that this is kind of indicative of that being kind of placed upon people. That when it comes to people that have been reported to being most likely to have run away and tried to find their own sort of support, that's kind of where those different axes of oppression are kind of multiplying on different people. So out of all of this as well, there was about 80% or so that reported that at least one immediate family member supported them through some specific acts, and that could have been using their name, the correct name and their pronouns, giving them money to help support their transition, helping them change their name or gender on identity documents. But really, that should be like 100%. So even though that's 80% and still just one family member, and one immediate family member, so it could be anywhere in between, that number should be a lot higher. Around almost like 60% of the respondents who were even out to at least some of the immediate family they grew up with said that their family was generally supportive, and 17% had unsupportive families, and 24 had families that weren't supportive or unsupportive. But really within that, trans women were more likely to have an immediate family member stop speaking to them for a long time, or even end a relationship because they were trans. So in contrast, with transgender men, that was about 28%, and non-binary people, that was about 12%. And so that statistics as well is still from the USTS. So that's still even thinking about, trans adults, and what the overall reaction to just their existence was from their family. And over time, things might change. But even when it comes to those adults, so many of them have families that just aren't supportive. That's about 40% still. And so that's still basically a failing grade. And so all of this should be higher. And also, almost 1/2 experienced at least one form of family rejection that was outlined in the USTS survey. So having a family member who stopped speaking to them for a long time and ended the relationship and or ended the relationship. And also some of this more specific data is looking at Black trans respondents. I should have mentioned that earlier. So this is specifically, so all the points from the USTS are talking about Black trans people specifically and what that family rejection has looked like. And still kind of extrapolating from what we talked about school and earlier stats about family, when it comes to supports for trans people, if you had gone through all these different things, if you had gone through all this bullying, you were pushed out of school, not necessarily it wasn't you saying like, I just want to go to another school. You were pushed out of school because you were being mistreated. No one was listening to you. And then your family might not be accepting. Your family might not even be willing to listen to all the things that you're talking about. Staff still aren't either. You might have a little bit of acceptance here or there. So then how you start thinking about how these trans adults become stable then? How do you even start thinking about it's like affording like your first apartment, trying to find a job, trying to establish yourself. Like all of these factor in and multiply over time. And really also there's an additional piece of like violence that goes into that point as well. It's like we've talked about violence before, but there's also violence that does happen with family as well. And really, I wanted to highlight again, trans women were more than twice as likely to experience this kind of violence just because of who they are. And they were also more than twice as likely to have been kicked out of the house as trans men and non-binary people. Not saying that no one else isn't experiencing that kind of discrimination and pain and just mistreatment, but also this is another place where that explicit like piece of oppression is coming out. And as we talk about housing, this is like where it all kind of starts to line up for like young people's future, like from just being younger and trying to just get what you want out of life into being an adult and trying to establish yourself fully on your own. So about 42%, and this is the USTS still, 42% of these respondents experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, compared to about 30% overall. And so 42% of Black respondents in the survey, 42%. And for trans women, that was 51% to have experienced homelessness in some form in their lifetime. So talking about Black trans women, that's like 1 out of 2. So again, in thinking about this kind of compounding action, this is how that's kind of resulting out. This is how it's coming out. This is coming, and this is like what's really being shown is happening in our society, specifically to Black trans people, not just as they grow up, but as they become adults and kind of looking back over what the trajectory of their lives have been. In the past year of the survey, about 40% of those respondents experienced some form of housing discrimination or instability, like being evicted or denied a home or apartment because of being trans. And I think this is another point we talked about some of the bills that are going around, thinking about the Equality Act. What the Equality Act would do would bar discrimination in all forms of public access. And also it would talk about housing. And so that is a piece of legislation where the power of that legislation could be used to help protect Black trans people, and to help make sure Black trans people aren't being evicted from their home or denied a home or apartment just because of who they are. See, I think there's something in the chat. Oh, sorry. Got a time check, thank you. and again, like 22% experienced homelessness just in the past year, just from being trans. About 12% were denied a home or apartment, and 9% were evicted because of being who they are. And so earlier that was just experiencing some form of housing discrimination or instability. And now this is more specifically talking about them experiencing homelessness and exactly what those numbers look like in terms of being denied a home and being evicted. And again, even still thinking with all of this, this is still such a small segment of the US population, but yet we still have these outrageous numbers. I mean, again, I want to really highlight trans women throughout all of this, and that trans women were more likely to have experienced one or more of these forms of housing discrimination or instability. And that number is, again, extremely high. That's almost 1 out of 2. It's 50%. And to have experienced multiple forms of these. And I think that that is part of where, again, this compounding of oppression and these oppressions are coming out in so many different ways that this is what's happening. And it doesn't stop with housing, but you also have to think about, for example, mental health and access to healthcare. I mean, even for my own self, I find it difficult to find a provider that I feel I can truly work with, someone that can really honor my identity as a Black person, but also my identity as a Black trans woman. And to have one that is competent and can really still understand, well, not even truly understand, but at least understand how to work with me. And that's something that young people have found out as well. It's something that you just, as soon as you start to try to access your own forms of care, it's like you keep coming up against. And so Black, trans, and non-binary people overall were experiencing twice the rate of just not being able to find a provider or having those concerns, as well as they reported higher rates of negative experiences with providers. And so as compared to their cis counterparts. So thinking about that, it's even thinking about having some sort of provider that so many young people that really need these services are able to access them. And then when it comes to medical care specifically, it's, again, not being able to afford it, parental permission, and then finding that provider. So still, there's so many, that finding a provider piece is where kind of like that societal transphobia comes into play, but then also thinking about capitalism and not being able to afford it, for young people, like medical care is expensive. Like, how is a young person supposed to be able to afford it without basically the assistance of their parents and also their parent permission? So thinking about just that full spectrum of youth, there's so many places in which, you need to access this care, but there's all these different barriers for you in trying to access that care. And even going more specifically into mental health, and this is going back into like Trevor Project statistics, that in the past 2 weeks of when young people took the survey, they were experiencing, about 55% were experiencing generalized anxiety disorder, at least reported symptoms of that disorder within the past 2 weeks. And just basically, and from what we've gone before, experiencing this violence and transphobia from school, from family, and even if you are at the age where you're worrying about housing your own self, if you've been kicked out, like it totally would make sense. And rates were higher again amongst Black trans and non-binary young people compared to Black cis young people. And among 13 to 17-year-old young people, as opposed to those that were 18 to 24. This statistic kind of like parses it out a little bit more, which I'm really happy to see. But still, and really it really shows the disproportionate impact of all of this, and is really indicative of all the things that we've talked about. And just thinking about around 70% of these young people, again, we've kind of laid out a little bit like a narrative, like what might be happening in a young person's life and all the things that they might be going through as we've kind of gone through these different bits and pieces of data. But to really see it come out and like this in that when it comes to experiencing like generalized anxiety disorder, young people are suffering. And again, young people are suffering in silence. And when it comes to young people that aren't seen as being able to have that kind of access or being worthy of allowed that access, unlike our minors, it's very prominent that this is what they're going through. In this next point, for these next couple of slides, I'll be talking a little bit more about violence. Specifically, I know I've already talked about violence a little bit before, but these next couple of slides, I think about next 3 or 4 are about violence. It's just itself. So really this starts out, I'm starting out with like intimate partner violence that people are experiencing. And this is with the transgender survey again. So about 56% of those respondents experience some form of intimate partner violence, including acts of coercive control and physical violence. And trans men in this instance were most likely to have experienced some form of intimate partner violence, which I think is like a really interesting thing to point out. I have been pointing out just different parts of what trans women are experiencing, but it is interesting to also note in the Black respondents part of the survey that this is what Black trans men were going through as well. And about a third of respondents reported acts of coercive control by innocent partners related to being trans. And 44% experienced physical violence. And when it comes to these acts of coercive control, that can look like being told that they're not a real woman or man or really who they are, being threatened with being outed by having their identity being revealed to others, or being physically prevented from taking hormones. So those are some of these ways that this transphobia is kind of coming out on an interpersonal basis that a person might be having with their own partners, that this transphobia is coming out in a sort of violence, in that you're being told you're not really who you are. You're being denied your own opportunity to really exist in your full self with someone who's supposed to be part of your support, someone who's supposed to be someone you can trust and go to. But here we are with a significant portion of Black trans people experiencing forms of physical violence and then also coercive control. And going into some of the information around sexual assault, around 53% of Black trans respondents, so about 53% of Black respondents to the survey were sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetimes, compared to 47% in the overall sample. Both numbers are extremely high. But to also think about over almost like 1 out of 2 Black trans people have been sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetimes. And I want to really go back and kind of reconnect all these different things that we talked about, all those different failures in our societal structure for Black trans young people when it came to school, when it came to family, when it came to trying to establish yourself, to trying to find homes. And to think about how this all factors in. I think there's so much vulnerability, and we talk about the oppressive nature of just capitalism and being able to afford the necessities of life. I think that this is where it really comes out, that people are being pushed and there's an acceptance of violence against trans people because of this blatant and rampant transphobia just in the way our society works. And that's still in some people's lifetimes. Within the past year, there's about 13% of these respondents who were assaulted just in the past year. It's about 13%. And then a point that they noted out in the survey was non-binary people that were assigned female at birth were most likely to have been sexually assaulted within their lifetimes. I think that there's a little bit more we could have done with a little bit of the wording within it. But still, it's an interesting statistic to note. And then I also really I would like to see more information when it comes to Black trans people with disabilities. Within the survey and within the Black respondents part of the survey, it noted that people with disabilities, about 64% also reported a high rate of sexual assault in their lifetimes. And this is kind of where I would like to think about ableism and these physical and mental disabilities, where those are coming in as well, when it comes to how young people are being structured, well, how society is being structured, and what young people are experiencing, and the lack of supports that young people are getting from K through 12 onto their adult lives. And more, when we talk about the folks that were experiencing intimate partner violence, about 3/4 of them were working in the underground economy. And really, about 1/3 of those respondents who did work in the underground economy, so it's been defined as kind of like sex work, drug sales, other criminal activities, 1/3 of those folks have been sexually assaulted during that year. So that's about 1/3 of people that were working in the underground economy. And also about 60% of Black respondents who had ever done sex work, and so were still working in the underground economy, but specifically sex work, and who were doing that for income, were trans women. And I kind of want to stop right there and also really kind of demystify a little bit about that piece as well, because I think when we are talking about Black trans women, this is an interesting statistic to note, in that, yes, the girls are doing sex work to survive. But that does not mean all Black trans women are necessarily doing that, and that there's also a stereotype that kind of exists as well when it comes to Black trans women in sex work. And it's a stereotype that has become so prevalent. It's even thinking about New York State. New York State recently just repealed a bill that was basically dubbed the Walking While Trans bill. So there were some sex workers, and some Black trans women would go down there and give them protective methods to make sure that they can protect themselves while they're trying to make income. And basically what that law had done was basically saying that, well, you're under suspicion of prostitution because you're over there handing things out. And so basically what police would be allowed to do is, what if they suspected that you were, or even if you were just like walking around with condoms, trying to hand them out to people, then you could be arrested for that. So it was recently repealed, but that's another instance where that power is coming out against Black trans women specifically. And in a little bit, we'll talk more about the employment aspect and when that's looking like for folks. But I do also want to, this is the last slide I have about violence specifically. And I want to kind of like continue to build upon a bit of the narrative that we've kind of gone through of thinking about, Black trans women are likely to be kicked out when they're younger. You're likely to not have your supports as a young person. You're likely to not be able to find this access to care, medical, mental, what have you. And so you're also likely to experience some form of violence by your own family. And I think part of that also comes out into where the majority of trans murders in the US are. I think that that's part of the structural, and then there's also a bit of like a cultural piece that comes of transphobia that comes out, and basically trans misogyny, basically this hatred of trans women. This is kind of like where all that kind of comes out, and is indicative of these problems of our society. Because again, the majority of trans murders in the US are Black trans women. It's especially prevalent and televised in the US. So really, if you look back at last year, about at least 24 of the 44 trans people that were murdered in the US were trans women, were Black trans women. So you could go back and you can literally count how many Black trans women were murdered. And again, just being trans is understood to be like, we're a very small segment of the population. And so also Black trans people are also a smaller part of that population overall. But here you are having so many Black trans women die and be physically murdered. Malaysia Booker on the left. This is a picture of her in Dallas. And I say that violence against Black trans women is not only prevalent, but televised, because of how her her initial beating was televised and went viral on social media. She had an argument with, I believe she had an argument with a man, and then there was a group of men that attacked her on social media. And then later on, when she recovered, she spoke out against it, and then she was killed. She was killed several weeks later. And then on the right, you have Ayanna Dior, and last year she went viral because she was being attacked by a group of 20 Black men. And it had gone viral, and I remember everybody was talking about it. But just even in existing and just trying to be your own self, there's so many other instances where Black trans women are being beaten, are being attacked, and end up dying. These two women are just two examples of what's really a deep-rooted problem in our society and also in our cultural norms. Because when you think about Black trans women especially, there's this very intense Black trans trans misogynoir. So this hatred of Black trans women. And I think that comes in through how cultural and societal understandings of femininity play out, and how that's accepted as well. And I think that's what that leads to, as well as all the different structures that we've talked about, just when it comes to access to housing, that legislative power, and trying to come together for political power in some sense. So I believe that that's how all of this is happening. And well, not believe, I think this is how all this is really happening. And I kind of want to end it out with talking about unemployment. And so for Black trans people, about 20% were unemployed. So which is twice the rate of Black people in the US. And again, that's like 1 out of 5, and kind of recontinuing in the narrative that we've kind of built. So you've gone through all those things as a young person, and you're trying to establish yourself. You can barely even find an apartment that will take you, that you can apply for. But then also, how do you find a job? There's about 1 out of 5 were unemployed. And so how do you establish yourself? How do you have that kind of like economic stability to even provide your own safe space when you're really out on your own? And around the same number of folks responded saying that they lost their job at some point in their lives because of being trans. And so really, I think about with that one about the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court decision that came down, and thinking about that. And thinking about what that does, and not necessarily thinking about all the challenges to that, but really thinking about that what that says is that you cannot just fire a person just because they're trans. I cannot be fired just because I am trans. And really that really says that's a really powerful use of that kind of the judicial power to really establish something good for trans people. So combating transphobia through legislation. And again, Black trans women were substantially more likely to report being fired because of being trans. And then there's so many people that also talk about being fired, being denied a promotion, or not being hired for a job they applied for because of being trans. And that was about 30% compared to 27% overall. And Black non-binary people and trans women were more likely to be living in poverty than trans men. And so kind of trying to connect all of that back in, and sort of when we were talking about folks trying to find housing, again, where are we supposed to find jobs? The new court case does a lot of great things, but then I still think there's just more work to do as we try to make sure that's fully implemented across the country and it's fully adhered to, and to really try to survive any other challenges to that decision. because really what is at stake is the livelihoods of Black trans people. Again, if you've been put out of your home as like a Black trans woman and you're not able to get any other job, you're being fired because of who you are, even if some people might not admit it, then what are you to do? And I think that goes back into like that part where we're talking about how many Black trans women, about 60% of those respondents, were saying that they did sex work for income. And so it's a part of the underground economy. And although we don't want folks using the underground economy all the time, or it's like that's kind of something that we look down upon, at least. They're trying to make ends meet. They're trying to put food on the table where it is mainly just themselves. And they're trying to really, really just be who they are and to make it through the end of the day. And I think when you get to all these different places and go through all these different pieces, that ultimately this is kind of where it's coming out. We have so many Black non-binary people and Black trans women living in poverty, and Black trans people in general living in poverty and trying to make it out. Folks that are trying to establish themselves, or not even just establish themselves, but trying to figure out a place to survive just in our society. And I want to move now to have another clip. I hope it works. I hope it works. I really want it to work. Okay, it might work. Oh, blessed Father. Oh no. Okay, this looks like it might work, so I would like to play it. Okay, so this is an interview between writer and journalist Raquel Willis and journalist Amara Jones. And so this whole video is like 40 minutes long. We're not gonna watch all of it, but I do encourage people to watch it on their own because I think the discussion that they have is so powerful. And it's just something that even as I was listening through, I was like, I don't wanna take bits and pieces away out of this. But we have a couple minutes of it or so that I'm gonna go ahead and play out for us now. And Emily, am I doing okay on time? Should I shorten it to the little snippet, or can I play the full? Because it's like 9 minutes or so.
I think, is this supposed to end at 3? Well, it's 3 my time. I don't know about your time. I'm not sure when, but you can play however much of it you want, I guess.
Okay, I'll play the full little bit, and we're kind of ending, so I don't have any more like heavy data afterwards or anything like that. We've done most of the data, so I feel like this is a nicer, like a little bit of a lighter note to end with. So I'm gonna play the full bit, and we'll kind of go right to the end.
Perfect.
Cool. And let me know if you aren't able to hear anything.
One of the things that you said to me personally was that sometimes I think I was born at the wrong time. And so I'm wondering why you think that would be. What is it about now that makes you feel that way?
Yeah.
And secondly, what would the right time look like for you?
That's a good question. I think that that feeling of being, you know, born in the wrong time, you know, I think a part of it is just, I think the difficulty of just being a Black trans woman in the world, period. I think to a lot of people, I think because of social media, because of visibility, because of platform, because of success, there's often this idea that those things can erase all difficulties, and that's not necessarily true. And so I think when I was saying that, I was really speaking to the difficulty, even now in 2020, of just being a Black trans woman trying to leave your house. You know, like the amount of energy that takes. Or just walking down the street. You know, I think having lived in New York for like a year, it's just, it is so much harder to have to navigate and be in such close space with like strangers, you know, for most of your like waking day. Cause like when I was in the South, I could hop in my car, honey, I was in my own little bubble. So those things, you know, it's just the looks, I think, that you get, the fixation that people have on a lot of us when we leave the house. You know, you can't just go to the corner store without, you know, already dealing with the misogyny and the catcalling, right? But then people peering at you, trying to figure out who you are, you know, what are you, all of those different things. I mean, just imagine who we could be if we didn't have to deal with all that baggage on a daily basis, or being in a professional space and often still being the spectacle. You know, it's not like, I think when I was in college and it was like, I don't know what you are, but I'm like,
oh, sorry. Don't know what happened there.
to leave your house, navigate
We'll just start there.
and be in such
One of the things that you said to me,
There we go.
the looks,
Okay.
I think, that you get, the fixation that people have on a lot of us when we leave the house. You know, you can't just go to the corner store without, you know, already dealing with the misogyny and the catcalling, right? But then people peering at you, trying to figure out who you are, you know, what are you, all of those different things. I mean, just imagine who we could be if we didn't have to deal with all that baggage on a daily basis, or being in a professional space and often still being the spectacle. You know, it's not like, I think when I was in college and it was like, I don't know what you are, but I'm like intrigued. Well, in some ways it is like that, but I think, you know, then in the professional space, that coupled with the tokenism of like, you're gonna be this face that we need to save face to communities that we never spoke to, never thought about before. I think all of that is heavy. And it's not necessarily unique. I think a lot of marginalized folks have similar variations of that. But I think particularly being a Black trans woman in this moment of intense political, you know, polarization and people blaming you for
Wuhan.
Right, right. Well, Wuhan, but people blaming you for so many of societal ills, right? That
and actual violence.
And actual violence, yeah. So it's like all of that, and I think it's cute for me for a moment to be like, you know what? I should have been in some other time.
Yeah.
But I think the startling realization is that there will never be a perfect time. And I have to do my part in this moment, even when it's hard. It's political. I think it's cute for me for a moment to be like, you know what? I should have been in some other time.
Yeah.
But I think the startling realization is that there will never be a perfect time. And I have to do my part in this moment, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible.
What does the right time look like for you? So if you had to say, if you had to create an imaginary time, it doesn't have to happen, it can be. Where are the hallmarks of the imaginary time? Let's go there, right? Let's round out the conversation there.
Yeah.
Where for you, what does that look like? What does that space and time look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that looks like a time when everything doesn't have to be first.
What does that mean?
For us, we don't always have to be like the first Black trans whatever, you know, to do something, right? Like we can just be without even that burden.
Right. Trans people in space as astronauts.
Right.
That sort of thing.
I'm sure somebody is queuing up to be the first one of those. A space where we can express ourselves and create in healthy, beautiful ways. A space that doesn't have the same trauma and baggage that I think we have, right, in this moment in time. Yeah, I think a space where we don't have to use categories if we don't want to, and that doesn't have to be looked at as, you know, bizarre, right? Like, will we need terms like trans and cis, right? Or will everybody finally understand we're all gender non-conforming and we'll move it forward? It's just, I think, a space where we all kind of have infinite possibility. Like there is equity when it comes to possibility. And then there's safety, you know, there's warmth, there's sustenance, there's expansive thought. And I think most of all that there's empathy and love, and that we actually like value those as the most important qualities we should be instilling in the generations to come up after us.
Yeah. Well, and in all of that, right, that we have the equality of imagination. Right, that we actually have the ability to imagine our futures, right?
Yeah.
Because even one of the things that's becoming clear in the conversation with you is that it's so hard to imagine what your own personal future looks like, right? And what was so fascinating to me when I was speaking to a lot of the cast members of Pose about what they thought a trans future looks like, so many of them, like Angelica Ross was like, just to survive. Which was really powerful for me because here are people at the pinnacle of what everyone would think would be the highest levels of achievement. And all of the things that you spoke about, just literally walking out their house and existing and surviving still is a paramount concern.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I think it's really important for us to imagine a future and what the future looks like. You have helped us do that in so many ways. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we are here at Rosecrans, which is a combination cafe flower shop. Maybe that's
Okay, so that was just their interview about what the future, what the past, present, and future for trans people might look like. And now I want to get into just like some next steps really quickly. And so we've talked about a lot. It's been really heavy. But I want people to think about different next steps they can take in your own life, things that you can start doing. And first of all, I want to start saying like you could watch Disclosure. It's a very powerful documentary on Netflix about trans representation in media, stemming from like the early 1900s on over. It's rated mature, and so it's also got elements of sexual violence in it. So it might be a little bit tough to watch, but I think it's very critical, and I would like for more people to watch it. And I think it gives you a lot of great information that you might not necessarily have otherwise. Also, like they were talking about the actresses and actors of Pose. So Pose focuses on Black and brown trans people in New York City, starting with the first season, like 1989. So getting into like the AIDS crisis a little bit through the series. But it really centers these trans women, these Black and brown trans women. It really centers them, and it really gives them the screen time and makes them the focus, where their narratives are really true and really honest and really brought out to everybody else. I think there's only three seasons. It's sad, but I encourage people to go watch that. The first 2 seasons should also be on Netflix as well. The 3rd season is still coming out. It's in the works. And if you want to read something, you can read Jenna Mock's autobiography, Redefining Realness. So it's about her whole understanding of herself and what that looked like for her. And if you want to get into more like the theory, more like critical side of it, you could read Riley C. Snorton's book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. I've heard him speak before, and he's an amazing speaker. He's got great ideas, but it is a little bit more of, it's a little bit more of the heady one. So if you want to do that, I encourage you to look into both. And then also you do research on people like Monica Roberts, who founded Trans Griot and started talking about the deaths of trans people and bringing us more so into the mainstream. Marsha P. Johnson, who did revolutionary work and really helped become a mother of the movement that we're part of now. And also being an active combatant of transphobia and white supremacy in your personal and professional life. Really, I ask everybody here to really deeply question what that can look like. And to say, you know, how is this transphobia and like this white supremacy? How is this kind of showing up in my life? You know, how am I really being not just a true ally and an accomplice, but more so kind of like a co-conspirator, and really trying to make sure that trans people, like Black trans people, I'm really committing to the liberation of Black trans people and making sure that Black trans people are able to live lives just as good as mine. And with that, these are my sources, and that is the end of the presentation. And so let me stop sharing. I know we're a little bit over time. Thank you all for staying on. But if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those. And I will also put in, I have a survey. I did not, it will get the link. We will probably have to send the link out again to everybody in the email. Yes, my email is mspencer@oasiscenter.org. Putting it in the chat. If people can stay on for just one moment, I had it saved, the link for the survey, because I have like a short 5-question survey that I would like for people to fill out. So I'm gonna put that in the chat. So if you could fill it out at some point soon, I would really appreciate it. I would really appreciate everybody's feedback on this training. Just thinking about ways to continue to make this better and to really continue speaking truth to power for Black trans young people. And thank you, I appreciate that.
Okay, guys. Thank you, Maxine. That was wonderful. And I'm really thankful that you spent, the time to put that together and present it to us today. I think that was amazing. And hopefully we can all take something from that and apply it to our lives to make a better future, like your video said, for everyone. So thank you all for coming today. And also, Maxine, the email's in there, and also you all probably have Chloe's. So if you have any questions, you can contact them about this. And I think also that this meeting was recorded, and I think they post it on the coalition website, but I'm not sure about that. So if you do want to see the recording of the Lunch and Learn today, you can contact somebody for it. But other than that, if there's no questions, I guess we will dismiss. Maybe.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you all again for not only staying over but for wanting to be a part of this and to engaging in this conversation and engaging in this material with me, with all of us. And I'm very thankful to the coalition for inviting me to speak as well. So thank you to everybody.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening and the rest of your week. And yeah, a good weekend coming up. So thank you all.